This presentation addresses a common misconception circulating online, the claim that because childhood vaccines have never undergone double-blind crossover trials, their safety must not have been proven. At first glance, this argument sounds scientific, even authoritative. But when we look at what a crossover trial actually is, why this design is inappropriate for vaccines, and what methods are used instead, we see that the claim rests on a misunderstanding of both ethics and evidence. Today, we explore why crossover trials are not performed, why this is the correct ethical choice, and what rigorous systems truly demonstrate vaccine safety. It is true that double-blind crossover trials for childhood vaccines do not exist. But it is completely false to conclude that safety was never proven. Crossover trials are not used because they are unethical and scientifically inappropriate for vaccines. They would require deliberately withholding or removing protection from children, exposing them twice to preventable disease, and violating established medical ethics standards. Far from being a sign of weak evidence, the absence of such trials reflects strong ethical safeguards. Vaccine safety is established through extensive randomized trials, long-term monitoring, and global pharmacovigilance systems that provide far more powerful evidence than a crossover design could ever produce. A double-blind crossover trial is a study where participants receive one treatment first, then switch to another after the first treatment's effects have worn off. Each participant acts as their own control. This method is useful for treatments with short-term, reversible effects, like pain medications or sleep aids, where the intervention can be washed out and the participant can safely return to baseline. Vaccines do not fit this profile. Their purpose is to create long-lasting immunity that cannot be undone. Because vaccine effects cannot be reversed or washed out, the basic mechanics of a crossover study do not apply. Crossover studies would require leaving children unprotected from disease for part of the trial, exposing them to preventable illness. To complete the crossover phase, a child would need to experience both conditions, vaccinated and unvaccinated. This means deliberately doubling the time they are at risk of contracting serious diseases like measles, pertussis, or HIV. Such exposure violates the ethical principles governing pediatric research internationally. No responsible ethics board would approve a study requiring children to undergo prolonged or repeated vulnerability to dangerous infections. Therefore, the absence of crossover trials is not a sign of insufficient testing, it is a sign that children are not used as experimental subjects in ways that could harm them. Instead of crossover trials, vaccines undergo large randomized controlled trials, followed by extensive observational studies, global monitoring networks, and decades of accumulated real-world safety data. These systems include Phase I, II, and III clinical trials, post-market safety surveillance, and real-time adverse event reporting across millions of doses. This approach detects even extremely rare side effects more effectively than a crossover trial ever could. The scientific community relies on these methods precisely because they are safer, more ethical, and far more statistically powerful. The claim that no crossover trials exist is often presented as if it were evidence of a cover-up, when in fact it reflects ethical practice. Anti-vaccine narratives misuse the absence of crossover trials to suggest that governments and scientists avoided rigorous testing. This framing exploits the public's unfamiliarity with research design. The truth is that modern vaccines have more safety data, across more populations, over longer periods of time, than almost any other medical intervention. The narrative reframes an ethical requirement, the refusal to expose children to unnecessary harm, as if it were a scientific flaw, misleading the public and eroding trust. It is true that no double-blind crossover trials of childhood vaccines exist. But it is false to claim that this means vaccine safety was never established. Crossover trials are inappropriate for vaccines by definition. They would violate ethics, provide little additional scientific insight, and expose children to harm. In contrast, the safety of childhood vaccines has been demonstrated through decades of real-world data, gold standard randomized trials, and continuous monitoring across global health systems. In conclusion, the argument that vaccines are unsafe because crossover trials do not exist is based on a misunderstanding of research ethics and scientific evidence. Crossover trials cannot be performed without violating fundamental protections for children, and so they are not used. Instead, vaccine safety is established through methods that are scientifically stronger and ethically responsible. The overwhelming evidence from clinical trials, surveillance networks, and billions of administered doses worldwide shows that vaccines are among the safest and most effective medical tools we have. Understanding how vaccine studies work helps build informed, resilient communities that can separate science from misinformation. The American Academy of Pediatrics provides an overview of how childhood vaccines are studied, including the use of placebos and the ethical standards guiding pediatric research. The Centers for Disease Control and Prevention outlines the vaccine testing process from development through post-market monitoring, explaining why certain study designs are inappropriate. The CIOMS-WHO ethical guidelines clarify the ethical obligations researchers have when children are involved in trials, reinforcing why crossover designs are unacceptable. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration details the rigorous clinical trial phases and regulatory pathways vaccines must meet before approval. Finally, the World Health Organization summarizes global vaccine safety systems, demonstrating how long-term monitoring ensures continued safety across countries and populations. These sources collectively show that vaccines are tested with methods that are safer, stronger, and more ethical than crossover trials. Viewers can pause here to review each source that contributed to the scientific and ethical foundations of this presentation. For more fact-based content about Canadian politics, democratic health, economic trends, and rhetorical analysis, the Facts for Canadians platforms offer ongoing resources and educational material. These outlets aim to strengthen public understanding, improve media literacy, and support evidence-based democratic engagement.